His Grace paid the debtor's price in full, and told the hall she was already his. Narrated by Lord Edmund Ashcroft, the Duke of Dunmore's younger brother. I have watched my brother ride into cannon fire without blinking. I have seen him stand alone before Parliament and silence a chamber of 200 men with a single sentence. I have watched him bury our father, our mother, and a friend he loved like his own blood, and never once let his face crack. I have never seen him afraid. Until the morning they put Miss Cecily Holt on the steps of Pendlewick Hall and called out her father's debts. I should tell you what Pendlewick Hall was in the autumn of 1842. It was the largest private auction house in the northern counties, which is a dignified way of saying that it was the place where men who had run out of time were stripped of everything they had built piece by piece, while other men with cold eyes and warm pockets decided the worth of it all. Furniture, horses, land, and sometimes, in the fashion of that particular era's cruelest convenience, a daughter. Not sold outright, nothing so crude, but the debtor's household staff would be dismissed, the house would be forfeit, and if a daughter of marriageable age happened to be present on the steps, every creditor in the county would take note of her situation. The unspoken auction was always the most efficient one. Cecily Holt was 23. Her father, Mr. Arthur Holt, had been a linen merchant of some standing until a single bad season, a partner who absconded with the accounts, and one winter of unexpected illness had reduced him from standing to ruin. By the morning I speak of, Mr. Holt was confined to his bed at the inn on the edge of the village, unable to rise, and Cecily had come to Pendlewick Hall alone. I want you to understand what that means. She had come alone, no chaperone, no ally, no family name to shield her, into a hall full of creditors and collectors and men who assessed value the way they assessed horseflesh. And she had come not to beg, not to weep, not to throw herself on the mercy of men who had none. She had come to stand witness to the accounting of her father's life's work, because she believed someone from the family ought to be there. That is the kind of woman she was. I was there because my brother had asked me to attend in his place. He held a minor creditor's interest in a parcel of Holt's land, a small thing, something inherited, nothing he had ever thought about. He had sent me to sign whatever release was needed and be done with it. He himself had a matter in the village, he said. He would meet me after. I remember thinking it was unlike him to delegate something so minor. My brother attends to his own affairs, always. I did not understand until much later that he had driven through the village first, that he had stopped at the inn, that he had spoken to the landlord and learned that a young woman named Miss Holt was already on her way to Pendlewick Hall, alone, and that he had turned his horse and followed her. The auctioneer had a practiced voice, the kind of voice that could read a man's ruin aloud and make it sound like the recitation of a dinner menu. He moved through Holt's assets with brisk efficiency. The land parcels first, then the warehouse lease, then the contents of the house, a watercolor, a writing desk, a set of silver plate that had been a wedding gift. Cecily stood to one side of the steps, a little apart from the creditors, and she did not move and she did not look away. She watched every item called. I found myself watching her. There was something about the way she held herself, straight-backed, hands clasped, chin level, that was deeply, quietly remarkable. Not defiance, not performance. Simply, I will not make this easier for you by pretending it is not happening. The hall murmured. Several of the creditors glanced at her in the way I described that assessing glance. I saw a man I knew slightly, a mill owner named Gravitt, lean to his solicitor and say something behind his hand. The solicitor smiled. I felt the back of my neck go cold. Then the side door opened. My brother does not enter rooms. He occupies them. He has always had that quality, not arrogance exactly, but a density of presence that makes the air in a space rearrange itself. When the Duke of Dunmore walks in, men straighten without knowing why they are doing it. He came in quietly enough, but within 30 seconds, every head in Pendlewick Hall had turned. He walked directly to the auctioneer's table and set down a leather folio. He did not raise his voice. He did not look at the creditors or the mill owner or the solicitor with the cold smile. He looked at Cecily Holt. Only for a moment, just long enough for her to see him and for something in her face to shift, not relief, not yet, because she did not know yet what was in the folio, just recognition. You came. Then he turned to the auctioneer. I have reviewed the full accounting of Mr. Arthur Holt's outstanding debt, my brother said. Principal, interest, and all incurred costs as of this morning. I have instructed my solicitor to deliver a banker's order for the complete sum, not the land parcel, Mr. Harwick, the complete sum, to the creditor's table within the hour. The hall went very still. In addition, he said, and his voice was exactly as it always was measured, uninfluenced by the staring faces, quiet in the way that large, still bodies of water are quiet. I have written to Mr. Holt this morning with an offer of a position in estate management for the Dunmore holdings in the Eastern County. The position carries a house, a salary, and no conditions beyond competence. The offer is made without obligation and without expectation of any kind. He paused. Mr. Holt's debts are discharged, his affairs are settled. I would suggest, and here, for the first time, he did look at the room, just briefly, just long enough, that there is no further business to conduct. Gravitt, the mill owner, stepped forward. He had that particular look that men wear when they have planned something and refuse to acknowledge that the plan has been made irrelevant. Your Grace, he said, the young woman's situation is not a topic for this hall, my brother said. Just that, 4 words in the same measured tone. Gravitt opened his mouth. I will say it more plainly if you require it, my brother said, and this time the quiet in his voice had a different quality. Not a threat exactly, but the sound of a man who has decided something and will not be moved. Miss Holt is not a creditor's concern. She is not an asset. She is not a subject for this room's discussion. She came here today because she is a woman of integrity who believed her family deserved a witness, and I will not stand in this hall and watch that integrity rewarded with the particular attention I can see several of you considering. The room was absolutely silent. We are finished, my brother said. He walked to her afterward in the entrance court, where she had gone to collect herself in the thin October light. I watched from the doorway not to intrude, but because I could not quite make myself look away. She turned when she heard his step. She was not a woman who startled easily. I had gathered that in the first 10 minutes of watching her, but she was not entirely steady either. The morning had cost her something, and it showed just slightly in the line of her shoulders. Your Grace, she said, her voice was clear. Miss Holt, he stopped a few feet from her. I apologize for the manner of my intervention. I would have preferred to address the debts before the auction was called. I did not receive the notice of proceedings until last evening. She looked at him steadily. You did not need to intervene at all. No, he agreed. My father's debts are not your concern. They were not, a pause. They are now settled regardless. I don't know, she said slowly, whether I ought to thank you or whether I ought to ask you what you expect in return. I think most men would have been stung by that. My brother was not. He looked at her, that same look he had given her across the hall, direct and unhurried, and said, Nothing. Men do not pay a stranger's debts for nothing. I had a creditor's interest in the land, he said. I released it. The rest, the offer to your father, I made because it is in my power to make it, and because a man who built something and lost it through misfortune rather than dishonesty ought not to lose everything that follows from it as well. There is no condition attached to your acceptance or your father's. You are free to refuse every part of it. She was quiet for a moment. Behind us, I could hear the auctioneer's hall beginning to empty, the murmur of men departing with less to talk about than they had expected. Why did you speak to Gravitt the way you did? She asked. Because he was going to say something that would have required me to be considerably less civil. The smallest thing happened at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, not yet, but the beginning of one. You came, she said, because you had heard what was happening, not only for the land. He did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was quieter than it had been in the hall, not softer exactly, but less defended. I drove through the village this morning, he said. The landlord at the White Hart told me a young woman had walked to Pendlewick Hall alone. He seemed troubled by it. I found that I was also troubled by it. A stranger's business, she said. Yes, he said. And yet, I will not pretend I understood in that moment what I was watching. I was 28 years old, and I thought I understood my brother, his severity, his silences, his complete indifference to the opinion of rooms full of men. What I had not understood was that his indifference was very specific. He did not care what powerful, comfortable men thought of him. He cared, with a particularity that he kept entirely private, about the people who showed up alone and held themselves straight when the world arranged itself against them. Cecily Holt, I would learn in the months that followed, had been doing that her entire life. She had managed her father's household through 3 years of slow financial decline without complaint. She had taught herself her father's accounts when his eyesight began to fail, and had caught the discrepancy in the partners' ledgers 6 months before anyone else. She had written the letters to the creditors, measured, precise, offering every honest arrangement she could devise, and received in return the particular contempt that men in certain circles reserve for a woman who dares to understand numbers. My brother learned all of this slowly, and in the way that my brother learns things, not through questions but through paying attention. He found reasons to call at the inn. He arranged for the position in estate management to be offered with immediate housing, so that her father could be moved from the inn to somewhere warm before the worst of November. He sent a physician, not his own physician, who would have been conspicuous, but a good man from a neighboring town who arrived as if by coincidence and left a bill that never seemed to reach anyone. He did none of this to be thanked. He did not tell me about any of it. I found out from the landlord and from the estate manager who processed the housing arrangement, and from the physician's wife who mentioned it to my own wife at a card party in December. My brother, the Highland Duke of Dunmore, the man Parliament described as unmovable, and the county described as feared, was quietly dismantling every obstacle between a debtor's daughter and a stable life. And he was doing it with the same matter-of-fact thoroughness with which he did everything, as if it were simply a set of problems to be solved, and the solving of them was its own reason. What he had not accounted for was that Cecily Holt was, in addition to everything else, very perceptive. She came to Dunmore Hall in January at my wife's invitation, to my wife's winter gathering, the sort of modest country affair that involves 12 people for dinner and a parlor concert afterward. My brother had not arranged it. I want to be clear about that. My wife had her own opinions about Cecily Holt, formed from the reports that traveled through the neighborhood, and she had issued the invitation on her own initiative. My brother had said nothing when she told him. Which I had learned by then was itself a form of saying something. She arrived in a gown that was several seasons behind the fashion and absolutely correct. She had a quality at a dinner table that I can only describe as composed attention. She listened. She contributed when she had something worth saying. And she had a way of changing the subject when a conversation turned unkind that was so graceful you didn't realize she had done it until you found yourself 3 topics away from where you had started. My brother sat at the head of the table and said less than he usually did, which is already very little. After dinner in the drawing room, one of the other guests, a colonel's wife named Mrs. Pemberton who had the social instincts of a particularly alert crow, said, in the particular carrying tone of a woman who intends to be overheard, "One hears the Holt family is quite recovered from their misfortune. Convenient, isn't it, how some misfortunes resolve themselves?" And she looked briefly but unmistakably at Cecily. The room went slightly careful. Cecily set down her cup. "My father worked hard for 30 years, she said pleasantly, and lost through a partner's dishonesty what he had built through his own honesty. I don't find that particularly convenient as a subject for drawing-room conversation, but I'm happy to discuss it plainly if you prefer that to the alternative." Mrs. Pemberton blinked. "The alternative," Cecily said in exactly the same tone, "being that we talk about something more interesting." In the silence that followed, my brother from across the room said, "Miss Holt, would you take some air? The gallery windows look onto the north garden and it is a clear night." It was not a question exactly, but it was offered, not commanded, an escape route, offered to the woman who had, in fact, not needed rescuing. She looked at him for a moment, then, "Thank you, Your Grace, I would." I don't know what passed between them in the gallery. My wife has theories. What I know is that when they returned, perhaps 20 minutes later, Cecily Holt's composure was exactly what it had always been, and my brother's face had in it something I had not seen in many years. Not peace, precisely, something more active than that. The look of a man who has decided something that he had been refusing to decide for a long time. He spoke to my father-in-law 3 days later, not to ask anything, but to say that he intended to call on Mr. Arthur Holt with a particular purpose, and that he wanted to be transparent about it with the family connection. He then drove to the estate house and sat with Mr. Holt for 2 hours. I was not present. I have, however, met Mr. Arthur Holt, and I can tell you that he is not a man who intimidates easily, and that he asked my brother 3 questions, and that my brother answered all three of them to the old man's apparent satisfaction, because afterward Mr. Holt sent for Cecily and spoke to her alone, and after that there was a long silence in the house, and then the sound of a window being opened, which I am told is what Cecily did when she needed to think. She kept him waiting 3 weeks. Not cruelly, she did not ignore his call, or refuse his letters, or treat the matter with less than the seriousness it deserved. She simply told him, when he came to the estate house, and sat in the small front parlor with his hat in his hands like any man in England, that she wanted to think clearly, and that she required time to be certain that what she was feeling was her own feeling, and not the natural warmth one develops for a person who has shown one extraordinary kindness. He said he understood that completely, and that he would wait as long as she required. She told him rather sharply that she did not want to be told he would wait patiently, because it made her feel as though she were being managed. She wanted him to say what he actually wanted. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I want you to come home to Dunmore Hall. I want to hear you correct me when I am wrong about something, which I suspect will be often, and which I find I do not mind at all. I want to know what you see when you look at the North Garden in February. I want to introduce you to Parliament as my wife and watch every man in the room reassess his assumptions. And I want you to know, I need you to know, that everything I did in the autumn I did because I could not do otherwise, not because I wanted anything from you in return. If you say no, I will remain in your debt, but I would very much like you to say yes." 3 weeks later, she did. The announcement was made at the county's spring assembly, the largest gathering of the northern families, the sort of evening where news travels the length of the room in 4 minutes. My brother arrived with Cecily on his arm. She was wearing a gown the color of deep winter sky, and she held herself exactly as she had on the steps of Pendlewick Hall, straight-backed, chin level, entirely herself. I watched Gravitt, the mill owner, see them enter. I watched Mrs. Pemberton see them. I watched the room understand, in the way that rooms understand things, that this was not a rumor but a fact, and that the Duke of Dunmore had arrived with Miss Cecily Holt, formerly of the Holt linen family, formerly of the Pendlewick Hall auction steps, and was looking at anyone who had something to say about it with the particular expression he used in Parliament, when he was prepared to be very specific and very calm for a very long time. Nobody said anything. My brother led her onto the floor for the first dance. He was not, in general, a man who danced. I think I had seen him dance twice in my life. He danced that evening with the quiet deliberateness of a man performing a public statement in the most eloquent language available to him. Cecily, for her part, danced with the composure she brought to everything, and with something else besides. Something that was, I think, simply happiness, which she wore as she wore everything, without performance, without apology, and in a way that made it look like the most natural thing in the world. Afterward, when the floor cleared and the assembly stood back in its murmuring clusters, my brother leaned close to her and said something. I was too far away to hear it. Whatever it was made her turn and look at him with an expression I had never seen on her face before, an expression that had nothing guarded about it at all. He offered her his arm. She took it. They walked the length of the room together, and the county of northern England parted before them, and nobody, not Gravitt, not Mrs. Pemberton, not one single person in that assembly, said a word. I have watched my brother stand in cannon fire without flinching. I have never seen him look as invincible as he did that night. They were married in the spring, in the chapel at Dunmore Hall, in a ceremony attended by 40 people and conducted without drama or spectacle, because they were both of them people who preferred that the substance of a thing be more considerable than the display of it. Mr. Arthur Holt walked his daughter down the aisle. He had recovered considerably over the winter, which the physician attributed to warmth, rest, and adequate nutrition, and which I attributed to the particular peace that comes to a man when he stops worrying about his daughter. I stood with my brother at the altar. When Cecily reached him, he looked at her in the way he always looked at her, completely, as though there were nothing in the room worth attending to except this. She looked back at him with the same directness she brought to everything, and then she smiled, and it was the least guarded smile I have ever seen on a human face. The vicar said the words, they answered them. Afterward, in the courtyard, as the 40 guests produced a considerably larger noise than 40 people might be expected to, my brother stood at the edge of it with his wife beside him, and a stillness about him that was entirely different from his usual stillness. His usual stillness was the stillness of a man who has armored himself against the world. This was the stillness of a man who had, at last, come to rest. "Well," I said, "because I am a younger brother, and it is my constitutional duty to say something." He looked at me. "Wells," he agreed. "She made you wait 3 weeks." "She did. And she told you she didn't want to be managed." "She did." "And you told her?" "Edmund," he said. "Yes." "Go and have some champagne." I went and had some champagne. But I looked back once from across the courtyard, and I saw him lean toward her and say something very quiet, close, meant for no one else in the world. And I saw her tip her head back slightly and laugh, a real laugh, unguarded, the laugh of a woman who is exactly where she chose to be. That is what I remember most when I think of that day. Not the chapel, not the vows, not the county assembly and the room that parted before them. Her laugh and his face when he heard it. My brother, the Highland Duke of Dunmore, who had ridden into cannon fire without blinking, smiling at his wife, in a courtyard in the spring, as if the world had finally arranged itself into the shape he had always suspected it could take, if one was simply patient enough to wait for it.